I was 26 when it happened, back in September of 2015. I had been living in Northern Oregon for almost a year, and one of the things I loved most about the area was how easy it was to get out into the wilderness. My apartment was small and noisy, thin walls, neighbors who never seemed to sleep, but within an hour's drive, I could be somewhere so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I had the day off from work, a rare midweek break, and I decided to hike a trail I had never done before. It was called the Switchback Loop, though loop was a lie. It was an out and back that climbed almost 3,000 feet over about 6 miles. I'd read that it was steep and rocky but offered incredible views at the summit, with a panorama of the Columbia River Gorge and the mountains beyond. That morning, the weather was mild, maybe mid-60s, with low clouds hanging over the foothills. I packed my day pack like I always did: 2 liters of water, a small first aid kit, a peanut butter sandwich, a headlamp, and a thin rain jacket. I wore trail runners instead of hiking boots because I liked the lighter weight, though they didn't give as much ankle support. The trailhead was nearly empty when I got there around 9:15 a.m. My silver Honda was one of only 3 vehicles in the small gravel lot. There was an older Subaru with a roof box, and a beat-up Ford pickup with mud splashed high up its sides. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and moss. Somewhere far off, I could hear the muted roar of the river. I signed in at the trail register, noting that the last person to write their name had signed in at 7:40 a.m. No one else had started after them. I clicked my pen shut, zipped my pack, and started up the trail. The first mile was easy, wide, well-packed dirt with gentle inclines. Ferns brushed against my shins. The light was dim, the kind of filtered green you get when the sun is behind thick clouds and you're under tall trees. I felt good, strong, almost too warm, so I took off my jacket and tied it around my waist. After about 40 minutes, the trail started to narrow. Roots knuckled out of the ground in irregular patterns, forcing me to watch every step. The switchbacks began here, sharp, steep turns that zigzagged up the slope. My breathing deepened, and I could feel sweat running down the middle of my back. There was no one else in sight, and the forest was silent except for the occasional flutter of a bird in the underbrush. That kind of quiet is peaceful at first, but then it becomes so complete that every small noise, like the snap of a twig, seems too loud. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every so often, half expecting to see someone coming up behind me, but the trail remained empty. By the time I reached the halfway point, I was tired. I stopped at a small clearing where the trees thinned out just enough to see the river glinting through the mist. I took off my pack, drank deeply from my water bottle, and sat on a flat rock. The stone was cool under me. I ate half my sandwich, watching a single crow circle above the trees. That's when I noticed something odd. On the dirt about 5 feet away from where I sat, there was a single fresh boot print. It wasn't mine, too big, too deep. The edges were sharp, which meant it hadn't been there long. I looked around for more, but there weren't any. No prints leading to it, none going away from it. Just the one. I figured maybe someone had stepped off the trail and the rest of their tracks were lost in the leaves and pine needles. Still, it made me feel uneasy. I stood, slung my pack over my shoulders, and kept going. The higher I climbed, the narrower the trail became. In some places, it was only wide enough for one person, with a steep drop-off to my left and a wall of damp rock to my right. I slowed down, placing each foot carefully. It was somewhere in the 5th mile that I first felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I turned around, scanning the switchback below me. Nothing. No movement. No sound except the wind stirring the treetops. I told myself it was just my mind reacting to the solitude. Still, my pace quickened. My legs ached from the climb, and my breathing was ragged, but I pushed harder. The forest felt different now, heavier somehow, as though the trees were leaning in closer. When I finally reached the summit, I expected to feel relief, but the view was smothered by low, gray clouds. The wind was stronger up here, carrying a chill. I pulled on my jacket and crouched beside a boulder to eat the rest of my sandwich. I didn't linger. The descent should have been easier, but it wasn't. My legs were shaky, and the rocks were slick from earlier rain. About a mile down, I stopped suddenly. There was a sound behind me, faint but distinct, the scrape of rubber sole on stone. I froze, listening. Silence. Then, after several seconds, another sound, this time a soft thud, like a footfall muffled by dirt. I didn't call out. I don't know why, but something in me decided that if there was someone there, I didn't want them to know I'd heard them. Instead, I started moving again, faster now. At the next switchback, I glanced uphill through the trees. For half a second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow against the darker forest, but then it was gone. My chest tightened. The trail twisted down in long zigzags, and every time I rounded a turn, I listened for footsteps behind me. Sometimes I thought I heard them, sometimes not. It was impossible to tell with the wind rustling the leaves. At one point, I stopped again, pressing myself against the rock wall to the side of the trail, hidden from the turn above. I waited. A full minute passed. 2. Nothing. I started walking again, but my mouth was dry and my palms were damp. My body was on high alert now, every sound amplified. The forest felt darker as I descended, though I knew it was just the canopy thickening. My thighs burned from the constant downward motion. The air smelled different here, more earthy, like the ground was holding onto moisture. With about a mile left to go, I noticed something else. The fresh boot print I'd seen earlier wasn't the only one anymore. On a damp patch of dirt, just ahead of me, there were 2 deep impressions. They were the same size and tread as before, and they were facing uphill. I stared at them, my stomach turning. Whoever had made them had been going in the opposite direction from me, but I hadn't passed anyone. I kept moving, my pace almost a jog now. My knees ached, but I didn't care. The trail opened slightly, and through the trees, I saw a flash of silver. My car, down in the parking lot. Relief flooded me, but it didn't last. As I rounded the last bend, I glanced back. Far up the trail, just visible between 2 trunks, was a figure. Tall, still, watching. I didn't wait. I walked quickly into the lot, unlocked my car, and climbed in. My hands shook as I started the engine. In the rearview mirror, the trail entrance was empty. No movement, no one. I drove away, checking the mirror more than the road ahead, until the forest was gone behind me. That night, I sat in my apartment with the lights on. My pack was still in the corner, my shoes caked with dried mud. I thought about the prints, the sounds, the still figure. I told myself it could have been another hiker, someone who kept their distance, maybe even someone heading up after a rest. But I knew how quiet the trail had been. I knew how close those footsteps had sounded, and I knew I wasn't going back to the switchback loop again. It's strange to even write that, because I've been hiking solo for years. I've always told myself that I know what I'm doing, that I've got the gear, the experience, the instincts. I know how to read a topographic map, follow a compass bearing, check the weather, and filter water from a stream. I've gone on 2-day treks in the backcountry where I didn't see another person for miles. But last summer, August 2019, something happened on a trail in northern Wyoming that still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. It was a Friday morning, a little after 6. The air was cool enough that my breath showed when I exhaled. I'd been staying in a small rented cabin about 30 miles outside of Buffalo, and I'd planned the hike the night before, about 18 miles total, an out-and-back route into the Bighorn Mountains with an unmarked connector trail I'd read about in an old forum post. No ghost stories, no local legends, just rugged country, dense pine forests, and wide-open meadows. I had my pack ready, 2 liters of water in a bladder, an extra one in a bottle, filter pump, first aid kit, a thin-down jacket, rain shell, GPS unit, paper map in a waterproof sleeve, and my old Mora knife. I'd packed 2 energy bars, a peanut butter sandwich, and some salted almonds. I was wearing trail shoes, not boots. It was a dry summer and I wanted to move light. I parked my car at a small gravel pull-off near an old logging road. No one else was there. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, and the light was still gray and flat, the kind that makes everything look like a black and white photograph. I locked the car, slung my pack, and started up the logging road, which gradually turned into a narrow dirt trail cutting uphill through aspen and spruce. The first 3 miles were perfect. The trail climbed steadily, but not steeply, and the sound of my footsteps on the packed earth mixed with the occasional wind through the trees. A mule deer crashed through the undergrowth to my right at one point, and I stopped to watch it bound away until it vanished into the forest. At around 4 miles, I hit the first meadow knee-high grass, dotted with wildflowers. I took out my phone for a photo and saw I already had no service, which didn't surprise me. The GPS still showed my position fine. I crossed the meadow and re-entered forest, where the trail narrowed so much I had to push past branches that left streaks of moisture on my forearms. Somewhere around mile 7, I reached the junction I'd been looking for. Not an official signposted intersection, just a faint, overgrown path heading off to the left. According to the old forum post I'd read, it was an old firebreak trail from the 1980s, not maintained but still passable. If I took it, I could loop back to the main trail about 4 miles later, shaving distance and avoiding doubling back entirely. I stopped, checked my GPS, compared it to the paper map, and decided to try it. The path was narrower than I expected. At first, it was just tall grass brushing my legs, but after about 15 minutes, the ground turned uneven, with loose rocks half hidden under the undergrowth. The trees here were closer together, the canopy thicker. There was no sound except the crunch of my shoes and the occasional buzz of an insect. Half an hour later, I started to get a faint, uneasy feeling. Not fear exactly, just that subtle prickle you get when you realize you haven't seen anything familiar for a while. The trail was still there, but barely, more like a game path than anything maintained. I stopped to take a sip of water and checked my GPS again. My position showed as correct, and I was still moving toward where the path should reconnect. But after another 15 minutes, I reached a spot where the path simply ended. It didn't fade, it stopped. Grass, rocks, and fallen branches completely blocked the way ahead, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. I pulled out the paper map, scanned the topography, and decided to angle slightly downhill toward a creek I knew ran parallel to the trail system. I figured I could follow it to intersect the main route again. The slope was steeper than I'd expected. I found myself weaving between lodgepole pines, stepping over moss-covered logs, sliding on patches of loose soil. My calves burned from keeping my balance. The forest floor was spongy with years of fallen needles, and it muffled my steps almost completely. Every so often I'd hear something, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, but it was always somewhere off to the side, never directly behind me. After about 20 minutes of this, I reached the creek. The water was clear and cold, maybe 2 feet wide, tumbling over smooth stones. I crouched to refill my bottle, filtering as I went, and drank deeply. I could feel the coolness in my chest as I swallowed. I followed the creek downstream, stepping from rock to rock, sometimes walking along the bank where it widened into flat gravel bars. I kept glancing at my GPS, but now the signal was acting strange. The location dot jumped 20 or 30 feet every so often, like it couldn't decide exactly where I was. I told myself it was just the tree cover. At one point, I saw what looked like an old metal sign lying face down in the grass on the opposite bank. I crossed to check it. When I flipped it over, I saw faded yellow paint and rusted edges. It looked like it had once been a Forest Service marker, but whatever text had been there was gone. Couldn't have been new. The bolts on it were completely corroded. That was when I noticed something that made my skin tighten. A faint trail of boot prints in the damp dirt near the sign. They weren't fresh, the edges had crumbled, but they were definitely human. And they led downstream the same way I was heading. I don't know why it unsettled me so much. Hiking trails have other people. That's normal. But this was off the marked route, deep in an area no one really had a reason to be in. I kept going, my steps quieter now, more deliberate. About half an hour later, I smelled something. It was faint at first, almost like wood smoke, but sharper, more acrid. I thought maybe it was a campfire, but as I got closer, it shifted, an almost chemical tang that made the back of my throat itch. The creek bent sharply to the right here, and the bank steepened into a narrow ravine. I slowed down, listening hard. Somewhere ahead, I thought I heard a metallic clank. Not loud, like something light hitting something hollow. Then silence again. The smell grew stronger. I don't know what made me stop. Instinct, maybe, but I crouched low behind a fallen log and waited. I could feel my own heartbeat in my ears. The forest was utterly still except for the creek's bubbling. Then I saw it. About 40 yards downstream, partly hidden behind a cluster of willows, was a small gray tent. Next to it, a blue plastic tarp lay spread on the ground, weighted with rocks. Something bulky was under it, but I couldn't tell what. The smell was definitely coming from there. I stayed crouched for what felt like 5 minutes but was probably less. No movement, no voices, just the tent, the tarp, and that smell. I decided to back away, slow and quiet. I didn't want whoever was there to know I'd seen them. I angled uphill, keeping trees between me and the creek, moving as carefully as I could. It took almost an hour to reach what looked like a real trail again. Narrow, but obviously maintained. My GPS pinged back to life properly here, showing I was about 4 miles from my car. I didn't stop until I reached it. I didn't call the sheriff's office right away. I drove 20 miles into town, parked in a grocery store lot, and sat there with the engine running, hands gripping the wheel. My mind kept replaying the smell, the tarp, the complete stillness of that campsite. When I finally did call, the dispatcher didn't ask many questions beyond location and description. A deputy took my statement later that afternoon. He didn't tell me what they found. I never went back to that trail. Even now, years later, I wonder about that tarp, about the sound I thought I heard before I saw it. Sometimes I tell myself it was just someone's backcountry camp, maybe a hunter's supplies. But then I remember the smell, and how I knew, deep down, that I wasn't supposed to be there. And I think that's what scares me most. Not knowing, and never wanting to find out. I still remember the exact date. It was September 18th, 2016. I was 32, working a job that kept me indoors way too much, and I'd been telling myself for years that I needed to get back into hiking. I used to do it all the time in my early 20s, but life, work, and the slow creep of laziness had made the mountains feel far away. That Sunday, I finally decided to change that. I woke up at 5:15 a.m., made a strong cup of coffee, and drove 2 hours to the small town of Ralston, Colorado, where the trailhead for Ridge Loop started. The air was cold when I stepped out of the car, somewhere in the low 40s. The sun was barely up, the light pale and gold, stretching over the ridges in the distance. The parking lot was empty except for one old white pickup truck, but I didn't see anyone around. I strapped on my pack, double-checked the water bottles, energy bars, a small first aid kit, a folded topographic map, and my phone with a portable charger. My boots were new but broken in enough that they didn't bite. The Ridge Loop was supposed to be about 13 miles, with a lot of elevation gain in the middle section. Nothing extreme, but enough to make me feel like I'd earned the day. The first couple of miles were easy. The trail was wide and well-maintained, winding through tall pines and patches of aspen with leaves just starting to turn yellow. The forest floor was soft with needles, and every step released a faint earthy smell. My breath puffed white in the cool air. I felt good, better than I had in a long time. Around mile 3, the trail narrowed and started to climb. The sound of a creek followed me for a while, hidden down a steep slope to my right. The air grew warmer as the sun rose higher, and I stripped off my fleece, tying it around my waist. I noticed signs of recent rain, damp patches of mud, droplets still clinging to leaves. But the sky was clear now, just a deep blue dome overhead. By mile 5, I reached a small clearing where the trees fell away to reveal a long view down into a valley. I took a drink, ate half a protein bar, and checked the map. The next section looked like a steady climb up to the ridge itself. I figured I'd be there before noon. The trail here was rougher, with loose rock and exposed roots. I kept a steady pace, feeling the burn in my calves. The higher I went, the less dense the forest became. The smell of pine faded, replaced by the dry scent of sun-warmed rock. It was somewhere around mile 7 when I noticed the first thing that made me pause. I came to a fork, not marked on my map. The main trail curved left, continuing upward, but there was a narrower path branching right. It looked well-trodden but overgrown in places, as if fewer people used it. The logical thing was to stay left, so I did, but I glanced down that right-hand path for longer than I needed to. It dropped steeply out of sight, and I thought I heard the faint rush of water far below. The climb grew steeper. My breathing turned heavy, and I was sweating even in the cool air. I stopped twice to rest, hands on my knees, staring at the dirt between my boots. My phone said it was 11:47 when I finally reached the ridge. Up there, the world opened wide. To the west, jagged peaks layered in shades of gray and blue. To the east, rolling hills fading into the plains. A light breeze cooled my face. I took out my lunch, a sandwich I'd made at home, and sat on a flat rock to eat. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. No birdsong, no insects, no wind in the trees. Just stillness. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes mountain air has that heavy, suspended quality. But the longer I sat there, the more it felt like the world was holding its breath. I started down the other side of the ridge around 12:30. This section was narrower, the drop-off on my right sharp and unforgiving. The trail twisted in and out of shadows. I was maybe a mile down when I hit trouble. A landslide had taken out part of the trail, maybe 30 feet of it, leaving only a steep slope of loose dirt and rock. I crouched, testing it with one boot. It slid instantly. Going around would mean bushwhacking uphill into thick brush, and the slope above was steep. I stood there a long minute, weighing it. In the end, I decided to try it. I leaned into the hill, planting each foot carefully, but halfway across my left boot slipped. I dropped to my hands, sliding a few feet before catching myself. My heart was pounding hard enough to hear. I made it across, but my hands were scraped raw and my water bottle had popped loose and tumbled away down the drop-off. Gone for good. That's when I realized I had less water than I thought. Only about a liter left. I told myself it was fine. I'd be back to the trailhead in 4 hours. 2 miles later, I came to another fork, also unmarked. The trail I was on kept dropping steeply, but there was a faint path climbing back uphill. I checked my map again. Nothing. The main loop was supposed to curve back toward the east soon, but this drop didn't feel right. The slope seemed endless, and I was losing elevation fast. I hesitated, then decided to follow the uphill path. It was faint, overgrown with brush in places, and I had to duck under low branches. My boots caught on hidden roots. After 20 minutes, I realized it wasn't curving at all. It was heading straight north, away from where I needed to be. I stopped, pulled out my phone. No signal. I stood there, heart thudding, looking back the way I'd come. The light was shifting now, the sun lower, the shadows longer. I felt a flicker of unease, sharp and sudden, like a needle in the gut. I turned back down the path, thinking I could make up the time. But somewhere, I don't know exactly where, I missed the fork. The trail just changed under my feet, narrowing, becoming rougher, until it was more like an animal track than anything made by people. The forest thickened. I kept expecting to see the main trail again, but it never came. I followed the slope down, thinking it would meet the creek I'd heard earlier, but it only led me deeper into shadow. I rationed my water, small sips every 20 minutes. My mouth was dry anyway. The air smelled different here, damp with a faint rotting sweetness. At some point, I admitted I was lost. Really lost. By the time I found the creek, the light was nearly gone. The water was cold and fast, and I knelt to refill my bottle using my filter. My knees ached when I stood. I followed the creek downstream, figuring it would lead me out eventually. Didn't. The creek wound back and forth, and the banks grew steeper, slick with moss. I slipped twice, soaking one sleeve to the elbow. My legs were shaking from fatigue, and the temperature was dropping fast. I found a flat spot above the water and decided I had to stop for the night. I had no tent, only an emergency blanket. I wedged myself between two boulders, wrapped up tight, and tried to sleep. I didn't. Every sound in the dark felt magnified. The gurgle of water, the creak of trees, the occasional crack of a branch. My back ached, my teeth chattered, and my mind kept looping back to that first fork I'd ignored. By dawn, My fingers were stiff and my throat sore. I followed the creek again, moving slowly. My calves screamed with every step. Around mid-morning, I spotted something that made my chest flood with relief. A cut log, clean and straight. Then another. Signs of trail work. 15 minutes later, I stumbled onto a wide, packed trail. I didn't even care which way it went. I picked a direction and walked. My pace was slow, each step deliberate. I saw the white pickup from the morning before I saw the parking lot. It was just sitting there in the same spot, windows fogged. My own car was a few spaces down. I don't remember unlocking it, only sitting inside, gripping the wheel until my hands stopped shaking. I drank the last of my water, started the engine, and turned on the heat. It was 11:03 a.m. on Monday. I had been out there for 29 hours. I've been back to Ralston since, but never to that trail. The Ridge Loop is still out there, and maybe one day I'll try again. But next time, I'll know that every fork matters, and that a wrong turn in the mountains doesn't have to kill you to stay with you forever. I've been hiking alone for years. Some people say it's dangerous, but I've always thought it was more dangerous to live a life scared of everything. Most of the time, it's nothing but dirt under your boots, air in your lungs, and the quiet hum of your own thoughts. Still, there's a part of me that's always been careful, maybe even paranoid about the real risks. Animals, weather, injuries, and worst of all, other people. It was September 2018 when I decided to take the weekend off and head out to the White Pine Trail in northern Idaho. I was 32 back then, and I'd done that trail twice before, but only parts of it. The full loop was just under 20 miles, which I figured I could split between 2 days, camping overnight somewhere along the route. The weather had been cooling down for a week straight, and that Saturday morning was crisp enough that I had to scrape frost off my windshield before driving out. The sky was pale blue with thin streaks of cloud. The kind of day where you know the light will be sharp until the sun drops and the temperature sinks fast. By 8:15 a.m., I had parked at the small dirt lot near the southern trailhead. There were only 2 other vehicles there. An old white Ford Ranger with a cracked windshield and a gray Subaru with a bike rack but no bike. I should have noted those cars more carefully, but I didn't. At the time, they were just background details, not warnings. The first few miles were easy, the path wide enough that you could drive an ATV down it if you wanted to. Pine needles muffled my steps, and the air smelled clean in that cold, resinous way that mountain forests do. I carried a 40-liter pack with my tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, and enough food for 2 days plus some extra. My water filter was clipped to the outside. About 4 miles in, the trail narrowed and wound around a slope, the hillside dropping off to my right. I passed a faded wooden sign pointing to Bear Creek Overlook about half a mile ahead. I figured I'd take the detour for the view. The overlook was just a rocky clearing with a waist-high wooden fence to keep you from tumbling down the ravine. You could see miles of forested ridges rolling away under the morning sun. I set my pack down and took a drink, listening to the faint rush of water somewhere below. That's when I noticed footprints in the dirt near the fence. They weren't fresh, maybe a day old, but they were deep, like the person had been standing there for a long time. Oddly, there were no smaller or lighter prints nearby, just the same heavy boot tread over and over in the same spots. I didn't think too much of it at the time. By noon, the trail had gotten rougher, with loose rock and exposed roots. I hadn't seen anyone all morning, which was strange for a Saturday on such a known trail. I stopped for lunch by a small creek, sitting on a flat boulder and eating a peanut butter sandwich. While I was eating, I thought I heard something, not right by me, but faint, up trail. It was like the sound of something hitting wood, a steady, rhythmic thump. It wasn't a woodpecker. I know that hollow tapping well enough. This was slower, heavier. After about 30 seconds, it stopped. The sound put me on edge, though I couldn't say why. I finished my food quickly, packed up, and kept moving. The further I went, the more I felt watched. Not constantly, just moments where the hair on my neck lifted for no clear reason. I kept telling myself it was just being alone in the woods for hours. Still, I found myself glancing behind me more often than usual. Around 3 o'clock, I came to a split in the trail. The map showed that both routes would loop back into the main path, but the left fork was shorter. I took it, figuring I'd rather get to camp before sunset. About a mile down that fork, I spotted something strange. A tree just off the trail had deep, fresh cuts in the bark, 3 parallel gouges about a foot long. They were too clean for weather damage and too high up for deer or elk antlers. I don't know why, but I reached out and touched the marks. The wood beneath was still damp and sticky with sap. Not 50 yards past that, I found the first thing that really made my stomach turn. A small pile of bones, not scattered, but arranged in a neat little pyramid. Judging by their size and shape, they were from a rabbit or maybe a squirrel. The skull was on top, facing the trail. I stopped dead in my tracks, scanning the woods on both sides. There was no sound except the wind pushing through the treetops. My heart rate picked up, and I started moving faster, telling myself maybe some kid had been messing around or some hiker with a twisted sense of humor. At 5:15, I reached a flat spot near a bend in the river that seemed like a good campsite. It was open enough to see in all directions, with a big fallen log I could use as a bench. I set up my tent quickly, ate a small dinner, and got a fire going. By the time it was dark, the cold had set in hard. I sat by the fire, listening to the river and staring into the flames, trying not to think about the weirdness I'd seen earlier. That's when I heard it again. That same heavy, deliberate thump I'd heard near the creek. It came from the woods across the river. For slow thumps, then silence. I turned off my headlamp and let my eyes adjust. The moon was up, casting a silver light over the trees. I couldn't see anything moving. An hour later, I crawled into my tent, zipped the door, and lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. I didn't hear the thump again, but once or twice I thought I caught the faint crunch of footsteps on leaves. Not close, but not far enough away either. I woke up at 4:17 a.m., freezing cold and with my bladder screaming. I didn't want to get out of the tent, but nature won. The fire had gone out, and my breath puffed white in the moonlight. I walked a few yards toward the river and stopped dead. There were boot prints in the frost. They came from the trees on the far side of the clearing, stopped about 10 feet from my tent, then turned back the way they came. The frost was crushed flat, meaning they had been made after the ground froze, sometime in the last few hours. I stood there for a long time, every nerve in my body lit up. Whoever it was hadn't touched my gear. They hadn't taken anything. They just walked up to my tent and left. To first light, I packed up fast. I decided to cut the loop short and take the old logging road that would get me back to the trailhead in about 6 miles. I kept glancing over my shoulder the whole way. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard someone moving behind me. The last 2 miles, I practically jogged. When I came out into the parking lot, my stomach dropped. The white Ford Ranger was still there. The Subaru was gone. And sitting on my car's hood was a single pine cone, perfectly centered. There were no other cars, no people in sight. I grabbed my keys from my pack, tossed everything into the back seat, and drove out without looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was back in town. That was 7 years ago. I've been on plenty of hikes since, but I've never gone back to White Pine. Sometimes, though, when I'm out in the woods and it gets too quiet, I still hear those 4 slow thumps in my head. And I still don't know which scares me more, that it was someone I'll never see again, or someone who's still out there, waiting. It was late October 2019 when I decided to do a solo hike through the backcountry of northern Idaho. The weather had been unusually mild for the season, and I'd been itching to push myself farther than I had in years. I was 32 at the time, in decent shape, and I thought a 3-day loop through the Selkirk Mountains would be the perfect way to disconnect. I'd done solo hikes before, but never this deep. Most people stuck to the popular trails near Priest Lake, but my route would take me along old fire roads, then deep into a section of the forest that had no marked trails, just old logging paths, faint animal tracks, and the occasional flagging tape from hunters. I'd spent weeks studying topo maps and Google Earth, noting the terrain, slope grades, and possible water sources. The plan was simple. Day 1, hike 14 miles into the backcountry. Camp near a small, unnamed lake I'd seen on satellite imagery. Day 2, push north to connect to an old trail that looped back south. Day 3, return to my truck. I left my apartment in Spokane before sunrise. The air was crisp and damp, the kind that makes your breath look heavier than it feels. By the time I reached the dirt parking pull-off, the sun was just cutting across the valley, lighting up the tops of the larches in that deep gold that only lasts a couple of weeks in fall. The first few hours were easy, too easy. The old fire road was wide, compacted, and mostly downhill at first. I kept a steady pace, feeling the weight of my pack settle on my hips. I carried about 35 pounds. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 3 days, extra layers, first aid kit, headlamp, and a small satellite communicator. I had bear spray clipped to my shoulder strap and a 5-inch fixed blade knife on my belt. The further I went, the quieter it became. No more distant hum of traffic, no more airplanes overhead. Just the wind moving through the needles and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the understory. I always liked that kind of quiet, but it has a way of making you hyper-aware of every sound. Around mile 7, I found the faint ATV track I'd marked on my map and turned onto it. The ground changed immediately, softer, uneven, covered with damp leaves and patches of moss. My boots sank slightly with each step, and I could smell the earth more strongly here, that deep, wet, decaying scent you only get in old forests. By midday, clouds began to build over the ridge to the west. They weren't storm clouds exactly, but they looked heavy enough to carry rain. I kept moving, not wanting to lose time. The terrain was getting steeper now, with more deadfall to climb over. At one point, I had to crawl under a massive spruce that had come down years ago, its roots exposed like a frozen explosion. Around 3 p.m., I reached the small lake, if you could call it that. It was more like a large pond, maybe 60 yards across, with dark water and a thick ring of cattails around it. The surface was so still it looked like black glass. There was a narrow patch of flat ground on the east side, just big enough for a tent. I dropped my pack and took a long drink from my Nalgene, my shoulders aching from the day's wait. After setting up camp, I boiled some water for a freeze-dried meal and sat on a log, watching the light fade over the water. The place was beautiful, but it felt heavy. Maybe it was just the overcast sky and the stillness of the pond, but it seemed like the air here didn't move the same way it did elsewhere. That night, the temperature dropped quickly. I crawled into my sleeping bag, read for a while by headlamp, and eventually let the forest sounds fade into the background. I must have been asleep for a couple of hours when I woke to the sound of movement outside the tent. It was faint, just a few steps in the leaves. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon nosing around. I stayed still, listening. The steps were slow, irregular. Then they stopped. I don't know how long I lay there before sleep pulled me back down. But when I woke again, it was to the pale gray light of morning. The ground outside was damp, and in the mud near the water's edge I saw prints. Not boots, not hooves. They were bare feet, human. The size was hard to judge, maybe somewhere between an 8 and a 10, but the toes were clear. Whoever it was had walked right along the edge of the pond, maybe 30 feet from my tent. There were no other prints leading in or out, just that short line of steps, like they'd appeared and then vanished. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe some other hiker had come through yesterday before I arrived. Maybe the prints were older and just looked fresh because of the rain. But the mud was soft, and the edges of the prints were sharp. Still, I packed up and kept moving. The route north was rougher than I'd expected. The old logging path was barely there anymore, overgrown with alder and young pines. I had to bushwhack for long stretches, keeping my compass handy to make sure I stayed on course. Every so often I'd get the feeling I was being watched. Not in the dramatic paranoid sense, but in that subtle, nagging way where you catch yourself glancing over your shoulder for no reason. I tried to shake it off. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a narrow saddle between two ridges. From up there, I could see for miles, rolling forest, a few rocky outcrops, no signs of human activity at all. That should have been comforting, but it only made me more aware of how far I was from anyone else. I dropped down the north side, planning to find a creek marked on my map and camp nearby. When I reached it, though, I noticed something strange. Along the muddy bank were more prints, bare feet again, the same size as before, and they were fresh, so fresh that water was still seeping into the edges of some of them. There were more this time, a whole trail of them leading into the trees. I didn't follow them. I just stood there, the sound of the creek rushing over rocks in my ears, my stomach tightening. I found a campsite a few hundred yards away, on higher ground, and made a point to set up with my back against a thick wall of brush so nothing could approach from behind without making noise. I kept my bear spray close that night, and my knife even closer. It rained after dark, a steady, cold drizzle that soaked the forest. I didn't sleep much. Every noise outside, every drip, every branch creak, seemed sharper, closer. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was cutting the trip short. I could push west and meet the loop trail early, then follow it back toward the fire road. It would add a couple miles, but get me out a day sooner. The rain had turned the ground slick, and the descent toward the loop trail was slow. My pack felt heavier than before. I kept glancing back down the slope, half expecting to see someone moving behind me. Around noon, I stopped to eat on a mossy log. That's when I saw it. A piece of blue nylon, snagged on a low branch about 10 feet away. I walked over and pulled it free. It was part of a backpack strap, frayed at the edges, like it had been torn. Nearby, half hidden under ferns, was something else. An old boot, cracked and stiff from weather. It was filled with leaves and pine needles. I don't know why that shook me more than the footprints, but it did. People lose gear in the backcountry all the time, but between the bare feet and the remoteness of this spot, it didn't feel right. The rest of the day was a blur. I moved fast, barely stopping, pushing until my legs burned. By late afternoon, I reached the loop trail. It was faint but visible, a ribbon of packed dirt winding through the trees. I followed it for hours until the light began to fade. I set up camp in a small clearing just off the trail. I was exhausted, but my nerves wouldn't let me relax. Every so often I thought I heard something behind me. A branch snapping, a rustle in the brush. But when I turned, there was nothing. That night was the worst. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, every muscle tense. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, in the leaves just beyond the clearing. They circled once, twice, then stopped. I stayed frozen, gripping my bear spray, my mouth dry. I never heard them leave. At first light, I broke camp in minutes and started walking. I didn't eat. I didn't stop. I just kept going until I reached the fire road. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, the relief hit so hard I had to sit down for a minute. I tossed my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. Driving out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the treeline. But there was nothing. I don't know who or what was out there. All I know is that I've never gone back. And now, every time I see bare footprints in the mud, even in a park or along a beach, I feel that same cold weight in my gut. I was 27 in the summer of 2016, living in a small town outside Missoula, Montana. Back then, my job at a landscaping company had me doing physical work all week, but my weekends were usually spent outdoors anyway. I liked being in the woods where it was quiet, and there was something about walking alone for hours that made me feel more grounded than anything else. I'd been hiking for years, mostly in local spots, but that August I decided to try a trail I'd never done before, one I'd read about in a regional hiking forum. It wasn't an official park trail. It was a mix of old Forest Service paths and overgrown game tracks. People online described it as moderately difficult and not for beginners. The biggest draw was a narrow ridge at about 7,000 feet elevation that supposedly gave a clear view for miles in every direction. The night before, I packed my bag: 1.5 liters of water, a small thermos of coffee, 2 peanut butter sandwiches, a bag of almonds, a rain jacket, a headlamp, a folding knife, and a small first aid kit. My phone was charged and in a waterproof sleeve. I didn't bring a GPS because the trail was supposed to be easy to follow if you stayed on it. I did print a topographic map just in case, folding it into my jacket pocket. I set out early the next morning, leaving my apartment at 6 a.m. The sun was still low, the air was cool, and a thin layer of mist hung in the valleys. The trailhead was about a 45-minute drive up a winding gravel road into the mountains. By the time I reached it, the mist had mostly burned off, leaving a pale blue sky. The start of the trail was wide and soft underfoot, lined with tall grass still damp with dew. The first mile was gradual uphill, and I could hear nothing but my own footsteps and the occasional call of a bird. I saw no other cars at the pull-off where I'd parked. That didn't surprise me. This wasn't exactly a popular spot. After the first mile, the trail narrowed and began weaving between dense stands of pine. The air smelled sharp and resinous, the ground covered in layers of fallen needles that muffled my steps. Every so often, sunlight broke through in beams, highlighting motes of dust and tiny insects floating in the air. By the third mile, the incline sharpened, and the path became rocky. My calves began to burn. Sweat collected under the straps of my backpack. I passed a small creek trickling down over smooth stones, cold enough to sting my fingers when I dipped them in. I refilled my water bottle there, filtering it before drinking. It was around mile 5 when the trail started to change. The pines thinned out, replaced by scraggier trees and low shrubs. The path became faint in places, just a depression in the dirt marked by scattered stones. I had to stop several times to make sure I was still following it. On the left, the slope dropped sharply into a ravine tangled with deadfall. On the right, it rose steeply toward a jagged ridge. As I climbed, the wind picked up. It wasn't strong enough to knock me off balance, but it carried a steady, low hum through the trees, almost like distant highway noise. I could smell the faint mineral tang of the rocks baking in the sun. My shirt stuck to my back, and I stopped for a sandwich. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a broken branch lying across the trail ahead, snapped clean in the middle. At first, I thought it might have been from wind or snow, but the break looked fresh, and there were scuff marks in the dirt on either side, like something heavy had passed. I didn't hear anything except the wind, but it put me on edge. Bears weren't uncommon in this part of Montana. I kept going, trying to stay alert. The terrain was getting more exposed now. Trees were fewer, and the sun felt stronger without shade. The trail narrowed again, hugging the side of the ridge. On my left, the drop-off was steep enough to make me careful with each step. I focused on keeping my footing, using trekking poles to steady myself. At mile 7, I reached the ridge proper. The view was staggering, layers of blue-gray mountains fading into the haze, valleys carved deep with shadow. The ridge itself was maybe 10 feet wide in places, with loose gravel that shifted underfoot. I could see the trail continuing along it, a pale scar cutting across the slope. It was beautiful but also unnerving. The drop on both sides was sheer. My heart rate was high from the climb, and I decided to sit for a while, drink some coffee, and let my legs rest before crossing. The wind was stronger here, pulling at my hat. While I sat, I scanned the slopes below. Far down the valley, something moved, a dark speck against the lighter rocks. I couldn't tell what it was from that distance, but it was large, too big for a deer. It was moving slowly, then stopping, then moving again. I lost sight of it when it went behind a clump of trees. That was when I realized how far I was from anyone. No voices, no planes, no sign of another hiker. Just me, that long, narrow ridge, and whatever was moving below. I crossed the ridge slowly, planting each step carefully. My palms were sweaty on the grips of my poles. A few times, gravel slid out from under my boots and bounced down the slope. I tried not to think about what would happen if I lost my footing. On the other side, the trail dipped into a small saddle between two rises. Here, the air was still and warm. I felt a little safer with the drop-offs behind me, but the silence was heavy. I didn't like not knowing where that dark shape had gone. I decided I'd go another mile, then turn back. The forum posts had made it sound like the ridge was the main highlight, and I didn't want to push deeper into unfamiliar terrain alone. But just as I started that last stretch, I saw something that made me stop cold. In the dirt ahead, half covered by loose gravel, were footprints. Fresh ones. They weren't boot prints. They were bare, human feet, smallish, maybe the size of a woman's or teenager's, the toes spread wide. The tracks were headed in the same direction I was going. My scalp prickled. I looked around. There was no one in sight, no sound of movement. The prints continued along the trail until they disappeared into a patch of scrub. I stood there for maybe a full minute, debating. My gut told me to turn around, but some other part of me wanted to see who was up here barefoot at 7,000 feet. I moved forward slowly, every sense stretched thin. The scrub opened onto a small clearing with a flat boulder in the center. On the boulder was a dented metal water bottle, lying on its side. There was no one there. The footprints ended near the rock. I circled the clearing, but saw nothing, no pack, no clothes, no other gear. That was enough for me. I decided I was done for the day. I started back toward the ridge, checking over my shoulder every so often. The wind had shifted, carrying a faint smell of smoke now. Not campfire smoke, sharper, like burning grass or brush. I quickened my pace, feeling more exposed with every open stretch I crossed. Halfway across the ridge, I glanced down into the valley again. This time, I saw movement. 2 figures, far below, heading uphill toward the saddle I just left. They were too far away to make out faces, but both wore dark clothing. I couldn't see any bright packs or gear. They weren't on the trail exactly, more like cutting across toward it. I didn't wait to watch them get closer. I kept moving, my boots crunching faster on the gravel. My shoulders ached from the pack, and my legs were beginning to feel heavy, but I didn't stop. Every switchback down felt longer than on the way up. By the time I reached the creek again, the smell of smoke was stronger. I could see a faint haze drifting between the trees. That worried me more than the figures now. If a brush fire was starting, I didn't want to get trapped. The last 2 miles were a blur of fast walking, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. My throat was dry despite rationing my water. The air felt hotter, heavier. When I finally saw my car through the trees, parked alone at the pull-off, relief flooded through me. I tossed my pack in the back seat and slid behind the wheel, locking the doors out of pure habit. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The trailhead was empty, but a faint column of smoke was visible above the ridge. Somewhere up there, 2 people, or whatever they were doing, were heading deeper into the mountains. I didn't know if they'd seen me. I never went back to that trail. I didn't even post about it online. For weeks afterward, though, I kept thinking about those barefoot prints in the dirt and how they just stopped at that rock. I remember the exact date because I had written it at the top of my trail map in black pen. August 28, 2019. It was the tail end of summer in Northern California, and I had driven out to the Trinity Alps Wilderness for a 3-day solo hike. I was 32, in decent shape, and had done enough long trails to feel confident, but not cocky. I'd been there once before, years earlier, and had always wanted to go deeper into the higher elevation areas. The plan was to do a loop starting from the Canyon Creek trailhead, up to Boulder Creek Lakes, cut across to Morris Meadow, then descend back through Canyon Creek. The weather was perfect, mid-70s during the day, high 40s at night. No rain in the forecast, skies totally clear. I set out around 9 a.m., pack loaded with 3 days' worth of dehydrated meals, a small tent, and my usual kit. My pack weighed about 28 pounds, which felt light for me. The first day's trail was steady uphill, but the grade was forgiving. The forest here was dense. Pines, firs, and occasional open granite shelves where you could see the ridges in the distance. The air smelled sharp and resinous, the kind of dry mountain air that makes you want to inhale deeper. I passed a few people in the morning, 2 older guys with fishing poles, a young couple with a big golden retriever, but after lunch the trail emptied. By 2 p.m. it was just me, the quiet, and the occasional sound of wind high up in the trees. By early evening, I reached a flat area near the creek with just enough space to pitch a tent. I set up camp, boiled water for dinner, and sat on a rock watching the last light hit the opposite ridge. As the air cooled, That smell of sun-warmed pine needles faded into damp earth. I felt calm, secure. Nothing about that first night hinted at the way the rest of the trip would go. Day 2. I woke up early, maybe 5:30 a.m., because the light was hitting my tent just right. I made coffee, packed up, and got moving. The climb to Boulder Creek Lakes is steep, and most people do it as a side trip, not as part of a through hike. But I wanted to take the Ridge Trail from there, which would give me a long view before dropping into the next valley. The higher I went, the less soil there was. Big slabs of granite, loose scree, and crooked switchbacks replaced the packed dirt. My boots crunched in a way that sounded too loud in the still morning. I saw fresh deer tracks in one muddy patch, but no other signs of wildlife except a hawk circling somewhere far above. When I reached Boulder Creek Lakes around 10 a.m., it was breathtaking. The water was that icy, almost unreal blue, and the surface was perfectly still. I took off my pack, drank half a liter of water, and just sat there. No wind, no bugs, no people. From there, I took the Ridge Trail heading south. It was narrow but not technical. My map marked it as lightly maintained, which in practice meant that parts of it were faint and overgrown. I had to watch my footing constantly. The ridge gave me constant views, sheer drops on both sides in some sections. It wasn't dangerous if you stayed aware, but I could see why not many people used it. Around noon, I stopped for lunch, tortillas with peanut butter and honey. I checked my location on my paper map and cross-referenced it with the GPS app on my phone. Both matched. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and yet, that was the last time I felt totally certain about my position. The turn. After lunch, the trail curved away from the ridge into a section of dense manzanita and young pine. The path here was much less clear, and fallen branches forced me to weave around. I followed what I thought was the trail, faint but visible, until it began sloping down more steeply than my map suggested. I figured it was just a short descent before climbing again. 20 minutes later, I came to a dry creek bed. The trail seemed to continue on the other side, so I stepped down, crossed, and climbed up the opposite bank. The soil was soft and loose, sliding under my boots. When I reached the top, I realized something was off. The trail I'd been following simply ended at a wall of thick brush. No sign of any cut path. I backtracked to the creek bed, scanning the opposite bank for the faint line of dirt I had been following. Nothing. It was like the trail had evaporated. I checked my GPS. It showed me maybe 100 yards east of the actual trail, but it was bouncing, sometimes placing me 50 yards north, sometimes 200 yards south. The canopy overhead was blocking satellite reception, and my phone kept losing a stable signal. I decided to just cut back west using my compass until I intersected the main trail again. But the terrain was rougher than it had looked. Fallen logs, steep dips, and boulders slowed me down. Every time I thought I'd see the trail just ahead, it was another patch of thickets or deadfall. By 2:30 p.m., I was sweating harder than usual, partly from the climbing, partly from the unease creeping in. My water was running low, but I still had half a bottle and the creek if I needed to refill. I told myself I'd be fine, just a temporary detour. The slip. While stepping over a downed tree, my boot caught on a branch, and I pitched forward. I landed hard on my left knee. The pain was sharp, immediate, and hot. I sat there for a few minutes, breathing, flexing my leg. I could still walk, but it hurt. Deep, like something was bruised inside. That changed everything. I wasn't just off-trail. Now I was off-trail and moving slower. The light in the forest had already shifted toward late afternoon, and I still hadn't found the main path. I pulled out my map again, trying to orient myself by the slope and the creek. I figured if I followed the creek downstream, I'd eventually hit a bigger trail or the valley floor. It wasn't the shortest route, but it was the most foolproof. The creek was slow-moving here, more like a series of shallow pools connected by trickles. The banks were slick with moss, and I had to step carefully to avoid twisting my other ankle. My knee kept sending sharp reminders with every big step down. Nightfall. Around 5:30 p.m., I realized I wasn't going to find the trail before dark. I decided to stop and make camp while I still had light. I found a flat spot about 20 yards from the creek and cleared away sticks and rocks. I set up my tent slowly, favoring my left leg. Dinner was quick, instant ramen with a packet of tuna mixed in. When the sun dropped, the forest became oppressively dark. The sound of water was constant, masking smaller noises. Every twig snap in the distance made my head turn, but I told myself it was deer. Still, I barely slept, waking every hour to check my watch. Day 3. The morning air was cold and damp. My knee had stiffened overnight, making it harder to walk at first. I boiled water for coffee and oatmeal, then packed up. My plan was simple: keep following the creek downstream until it met Canyon Creek, which would lead me to the main trailhead. By late morning, the creek bed steepened into a narrow ravine. The sides were too steep to climb, so I had to pick my way along the rocks, sometimes hopping from boulder to boulder. The water grew deeper, forcing me to cross back and forth to find walkable banks. Around noon, I spotted something that made my stomach drop: an old, weathered boot, half buried in silt near the water's edge. It was cracked, the leather rotting, but the shape was unmistakable. I couldn't help thinking about how it got there and where its owner might be now. I didn't stop to examine it. I just kept moving. The final stretch. By mid-afternoon, the sound of rushing water grew louder. The creek emptied into a wider, faster-moving stream, Canyon Creek. Finally, relief hit me like a wave. I knew that if I followed it downstream, I'd eventually hit the main trail again. The bank was narrow, with steep drops in some spots. I had to move carefully, gripping roots and rocks. My knee throbbed, my water filter clogged once from silt, and I slipped twice on wet stone. But then, at 5:10 p.m., I saw it. A clear, worn dirt path cutting across the bank. The Canyon Creek Trail. I almost laughed. My legs felt like they could give out, but I knew I was only about 2 hours from the trailhead. When I reached my car at sunset, the parking lot was nearly empty. I threw my pack in the back seat, sat behind the wheel, and just let the quiet settle. My phone still had no service until I was halfway down the mountain road. Only then did I let myself think about the boot, about how easy it had been to step off the right path and vanish into nowhere. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, windows down, listening to the sound of the tires on the pavement. I kept thinking about how close I'd come to becoming just another thing someone else might stumble across years later, half buried, forgotten in the woods. I was 29 when it happened. It was late September 2016 in western Montana, that odd time between summer and full autumn, when the trees are half changed and the air smells faintly of frost in the mornings but warms up too much by mid-afternoon. I had taken a few days off from my job in Spokane and decided I wanted to try a solo hike through a section of the Bitterroot Mountains I'd never been to before. The plan was simple: drive out early in the morning, park at the trailhead near a small logging road, hike about 12 miles into the range, set up camp near a small alpine lake, then hike back the next day. I had my Osprey pack loaded with enough food, a small tent, a sleeping bag, my camp stove, a headlamp, extra batteries, first aid kit, all the essentials. I also carried a small .357 revolver I kept for bear country, not because I was expecting trouble, but because Montana is Montana. The trail I picked wasn't one of the popular ones. In fact, I had only found mention of it on a backcountry forum where someone had posted an old Forest Service map. They'd mentioned that the path wasn't maintained anymore, but it was passable if you don't mind climbing over fallen trees. I didn't think much of that. I liked the idea of being somewhere quiet. The start. The drive took about 4 hours, most of it along a winding highway that cut through tall pines and followed a silver thread of river. By the time I turned off onto the narrow logging road, my cell signal had been gone for at least an hour. The gravel crunched under my tires, and the sun was just clearing the ridgeline, throwing long shadows across the forest floor. The trailhead wasn't marked by anything official, just a faint pull-off and a wooden post with a faded yellow blaze. There was no other vehicle parked there. I stepped out, stretched, and just stood for a moment listening. It was so quiet I could hear my own pulse in my ears. No wind, no birdsong yet, just the distant rush of the river down in the valley. I locked the truck, threw on my pack, and started up the path. The trail was narrower than I expected, just a ribbon of packed dirt winding between trees. I climbed steadily, switchbacking up the first ridge. The air was cool, and my breath steamed. The forest. About 2 miles in, I noticed how overgrown the trail had become. Sections were blocked by windfall. Some small trees I could step over, others thick trunks I had to go around. My calves burned from the constant uphill. I could feel beads of sweat on my back, trapped under my shirt, even though the air stayed cold. The forest itself felt heavier here than in the lowlands. The trees were old, with thick, dark trunks and branches high above, their needles filtering the sunlight into a dim green haze. The ground was soft with decades of pine needles. Every now and then, I'd see scat, elk, deer, something I couldn't quite identify but assumed was bear. I stopped once to drink from my Nalgene and noticed that I hadn't seen a single fresh boot print on the trail. The only tracks were faint, half-erased impressions, probably weeks old. The ridge. By late morning, I broke out onto a ridge. From here, the forest opened enough to give me a view across the valley. The mountains rolled away in jagged folds, their peaks sharp against the sky. The wind picked up a little, carrying the smell of pine resin. I ate a quick snack, a granola bar, and checked the map. According to the GPS on my watch, I'd made good time. If I kept pace, I'd reach the lake by mid-afternoon. The trail dipped down the other side of the ridge into thicker timber. This section felt different, quieter, but not in a peaceful way. I couldn't see far ahead, the trees closing in on both sides. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. Signs. It was here I saw the first thing that gave me pause. A small tree, maybe 4 inches thick, had been snapped in half about 6 feet off the ground. Not cut, snapped. The break was fresh. The wood was still pale and wet inside. Crouched, running my hand over it. My first thought was wind damage, but there hadn't been any storms lately, at least according to the forecast I'd checked. I kept moving. Half an hour later, I found more. Another sapling bent at an odd angle, a large rock overturned with the dirt beneath freshly disturbed. Could have been a bear looking for grubs. Could have been nothing. But I noticed I'd started walking faster without realizing it. Losing the path. Around mile 9, the trail all but vanished. Fallen timber lay crisscrossed in thick piles, forcing me to detour repeatedly. I pulled out the map and compass more than once. In places, I had to guess which faint depression in the ground had once been the trail. It was during one of these detours that I realized I hadn't seen any of the yellow blazes for at least an hour. I wasn't lost, not exactly. I could still orient myself by the slope of the land and the map, but I was definitely off the main path. Still, the lake was supposed to be just over the next rise. I decided to push through. The lake. When I finally broke out of the trees, I almost laughed in relief. The lake was exactly where it was supposed to be, tucked in a small bowl between ridges. The water was still and black, reflecting the clouds above. The far shore was nothing but rock and scree, but the near shore had a narrow strip of grass where I could pitch my tent. I set my pack down, took a long drink of water, and just stood there for a while, letting the tension bleed out of me. It had been a harder hike than I expected, but I'd made it. I set up camp, boiled water for some instant noodles, and ate while the light faded. Nightfall. As soon as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the temperature dropped hard. I pulled on my fleece and sat near the water, watching the first stars come out. Somewhere up the slope, a single bird called once, then went silent. That was when I heard it, a distant, dull thump. Faint, but heavy. Then another, closer. It didn't repeat like footsteps. It was more irregular. I froze, listening. Could have been a rockfall, but the sound carried a weight to it, like something solid hitting the ground. I told myself it was nothing, crawled into the tent, and zipped the door shut. Something in the dark. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. Not to a sound, but to a feeling, that prickling awareness you get when you know you're not alone. The tent walls glowed faintly from the moonlight, and in the silence, I could hear my own breathing. Then came a slow, deliberate crunch of weight on dry grass. It stopped. Then another. Closer. My hand went to the revolver. I lay there, barely breathing, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might shake the nylon. The steps circled, slow, measured. Whatever it was, it stayed just beyond my sight. I thought about calling out, but the words stuck in my throat. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded toward the trees. Morning. When I unzipped the tent at first light, the grass was wet with dew. And there, just beyond the fire pit, was a single deep impression in the soil. Not a boot print, too wide for a deer. The edges were clean, like it had been pressed down by something heavy. I packed fast. My plan to linger at the lake evaporated. The return. I took a different route back, following the map's contour lines to skirt the worst of the blowdown. The forest felt heavier now, each shadow longer than it should be. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, convinced I heard movement behind me. Mid-afternoon, I reached the ridge again and saw the valley below. Relief washed over me, but it was edged with unease. I hadn't seen anyone all day, not one person. When I finally stepped back onto the gravel pull-off, my truck sitting exactly where I'd left it, I let out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I started the engine, pulled onto the logging road, and didn't look back. Aftermath. I've thought about that hike a lot over the years, about the broken trees, the overturned rock, the steps in the night. I never saw what made them, never heard anything that gave it away, but the feeling, that thick, pressing awareness, stayed with me. It made me realize something I hadn't understood before. The wilderness doesn't care about you. It doesn't notice you, but sometimes something out there does. That was the last solo hike I ever did in Montana. I was 31 that summer, living alone in a small apartment in Eugene, Oregon. I had been hiking for years, mostly well-marked trails in the Cascades, but that weekend I wanted something quieter. I didn't want crowds or groomed paths. I wanted to be far enough from the noise of traffic that all I could hear was wind in the trees. It was early September 2017, one of those in-between weeks when the mornings feel almost like fall but the afternoons still burn like summer. The air that morning was cool enough for a light fleece when I left my apartment, but I knew by midday I'd be sweating in a t-shirt. I had packed my small day pack, 2 liters of water, a ham sandwich wrapped in foil, a few granola bars, a small first aid kit, a folded paper map, and my phone. My phone was an old Android that could barely hold a charge, but I had brought it mostly for the camera. I drove east, toward the foothills, watching the landscape shift from neighborhoods to rolling farmland, then into the dense pine forests. The sun was still low, casting long shadows over the road. I passed maybe 2 cars in the last 20 minutes before I reached the trailhead parking area, a gravel lot with room for about 8 cars. Only one other vehicle was there, a dusty red pickup with Washington plates. No one in sight. The trail I had chosen was called Ridge Trail 327, a lesser-known route that climbed steadily for about 5 miles to a fire lookout, then dropped down into a loop that passed a small lake before circling back. I'd read online that the path was narrow in places with steep drop-offs, and that the loop section could be overgrown. That was fine with me. I locked my car, shouldered my pack, and stepped into the shade of the forest. The first stretch was gentle, a gradual incline under tall Douglas firs. The air smelled sharp with sap, and the ground was soft with layers of needles. My boots sank just slightly with each step. I could hear a creak somewhere to my right, hidden by the thick undergrowth. Every so often, a bird flitted across the path, the sound of its wings startling in the stillness. After about a mile, the trail steepened. Roots crisscrossed the dirt, and I had to watch my footing. My breathing grew heavier. The forest closed in tighter here, branches arching overhead so the sunlight came through in thin, bright slices. I paused once to sip water and check the map, though there was only one clear trail and no turns to confuse me yet. As I climbed, the air warmed. My fleece came off, stuffed into the pack. My shirt clung damply to my back. I kept a steady pace, focused on the sound of my boots on the dirt, the occasional snap of a twig. Around mile 3, the forest began to thin. The trees here were smaller, more widely spaced, and through them I caught glimpses of the valley far below, a hazy patchwork of green fields and silver rivers. The wind picked up, carrying the dry smell of late summer grass. I could see the ridge ahead now, jagged against the sky. The last mile to the lookout was the hardest. The trail narrowed, the drop-off on my right plunging so sharply I felt my stomach tighten if I looked too long. Loose gravel shifted under my boots. My calves burned. But then I was there, the old fire lookout, a squat wooden structure with peeling paint, perched right on the ridge. I dropped my pack and sat on the steps, letting the wind cool my skin. The view stretched for miles. Rolling forest, the shimmer of a lake to the north, faint lines of distant logging roads. I ate my sandwich slowly, watching the shadows of clouds move over the hills. There was no sound but the wind and the faint creak of the lookout in the breeze. After a while, I stood and shouldered my pack again. The loop trail began just behind the lookout, dropping steeply through a mix of pine and manzanita. Here, the path was faint, almost swallowed by brush in places. I had to push through narrow gaps, branches scraping my arms. The air grew warmer as I descended, and the shade thinned until I was walking in near full sun. It was somewhere in this section that I first felt not watched exactly, but unsettled. I couldn't pinpoint why. The trail was still clear enough to follow, though I hadn't seen a blaze or marker in some time. The sound of the wind was gone here, replaced by an odd stillness. I kept going, telling myself it was just the heat making me feel off. About halfway down the loop, the lake came into view. It was smaller than I'd pictured, maybe 200 feet across, ringed with reeds and a few leaning pines. The water was still, dark green, with a thin scum of pollen near the shore. No signs of campsites or fire rings. I crouched to refill one of my bottles with my filter, the water tasting faintly of algae but still cold. From here, the trail should have curved west, back toward the main path. But within 100 yards, it began to break apart. Fallen trees lay across it, some clearly down for years, others more recent. I stepped over and around them, scanning for signs of the path ahead. I found faint prints in the dirt. Could have been from boots, could have been from deer, and followed them. Then I realized I hadn't seen any sign of the trail for at least 15 minutes. The ground sloped unevenly, brush clawing at my legs. I stopped and took out the map. It wasn't detailed enough to help much here. It just showed the loop circling back. I tried my phone, but the screen stayed stubbornly on no service. The smart move would have been to turn back the way I came. I knew that, but I thought I could shortcut west and intersect the main trail sooner. The slope dipped into a shallow gully, and I followed it, pushing through the brush. It was slow going. Branches caught my clothes, dry twigs snapped underfoot. The sun beat down through the thinner trees. Sweat trickled into my eyes. After another half hour, I was sure I should have crossed the main trail, but there was nothing. Just more uneven ground, more tangled undergrowth. The feeling of unease had grown into something sharper now. Every sound seemed magnified. The crack of a branch somewhere behind me, the sudden flutter of a bird from the brush. I told myself it was just the forest settling, just animals. But I started glancing over my shoulder more often. I stopped once, crouching low, just to listen. My own breathing was loud in my ears. There was nothing else. No wind, no birds, just the faint buzzing of insects. By late afternoon, the light had changed, growing flatter, more yellow. I knew I had maybe 2 hours before sunset. My water was low again. I pulled the map out, trying to line up the ridge and the lake in my head, and decided my only choice was to backtrack all the way to the lake. From there, I could find the loop section I'd come down on. The return was slower. Everything looked different from this angle. I stumbled over a root, catching myself hard on my hands. My palms burned, small pebbles sticking to the sweat. I got up and kept moving. It was nearing dusk when I finally saw the dark surface of the lake through the trees again. Relief loosened something in my chest. I skirted the shore, looking for the overgrown path back toward the lookout. That's when I noticed the prints. They were fresh, boot prints, deep in the soft mud near the waterline. Bigger than mine and spaced wider, as if the person had been walking quickly. The edges were sharp, no more than an hour old. For a moment, I just stared at them, the back of my neck prickling. I hadn't seen another person all day. The red pickup at the trailhead might still be there, but I had no idea if it was connected. The prints led away from the lake, in almost the exact direction I needed to go. I didn't like the idea of following them, but it was the only clear path. I moved as quietly as I could, heart thudding harder than the climb that morning. The trail was easier to follow now, but the light was fading fast. Shadows filled the spaces between trees, and the air cooled sharply. I kept glancing ahead, half expecting to see someone just around the bend. I never did. When I finally broke out onto the ridge again, the last of the sunlight was bleeding out of the sky. My legs ached. I didn't stop at the lookout, just pushed on down the main trail, the steep drop-offs now barely visible in the dim light. I slipped twice, catching myself with my hands. By the time I reached the parking lot, it was full dark. My car sat alone. The red pickup was gone. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, breathing hard, hands still trembling slightly on the wheel. I don't know who left those prints or why they were there. Maybe just another hiker, lost like I was. Or maybe they'd been behind me for longer than I realized. Either way, I never went back to Ridge Trail. And now, every time I hike alone, I make sure I can always see the trail ahead and behind. It was the summer of 2014, and I was 26 when I decided to hike alone in the northern Rockies of Montana. The plan had been simple: a 4-day loop through a section of backcountry I had read about in an old trail guide. The route wasn't famous, which was the appeal. I wanted quiet. The fewer people I met, the better. I had done long hikes before, but never in this particular section. The maps showed long ridgelines, deep valleys, and a network of unmaintained trails. I packed enough food, water filtration gear, a tent, a sleeping bag, and what I thought was more than enough clothing. The first day started well. The trailhead was empty when I pulled in just after sunrise, my old Subaru sitting in the pale orange light of morning. The air was cool, still carrying some of the night's cold. I hoisted my pack and started up the narrow dirt path, the sound of my boots pressing into the soil louder than anything else. Within minutes, the parking lot and the sight of my car vanished behind dense stands of pine. The forest here was thick. The trees were tall and dark, and the ground was covered in a layer of fallen needles that muffled my footsteps. The air smelled sharp, resinous. Occasionally, a shaft of sunlight cut through the branches, lighting up dust motes like floating embers. I kept a steady pace, my breathing even, my eyes scanning ahead for trail markers. This first section was simple, just a slow climb following a creek upstream. The water ran fast and cold, tumbling over rocks. My map showed I'd follow it for a few miles before cutting west into steeper terrain. By midday, I'd covered around 7 miles. My shirt clung to my back with sweat, but the air stayed cool enough that I didn't overheat. I stopped to eat lunch near a cluster of boulders, the creek beside me. The water was clear enough to see the fine grains of sand shifting on the bottom. I refilled my bottles and ate slowly, enjoying the stillness. Not a single hiker had passed me. The trail began to climb more sharply after that. Roots curled up from the dirt like fingers, and I had to lift my boots high with each step. My pack felt heavier. I adjusted the straps to keep the weight close to my back. The forest began to thin and the air felt drier. By late afternoon, I broke out onto an exposed ridgeline. The view stopped me cold, layer upon layer of mountains rolling away in the hazy distance, deep valleys cutting between them. The wind was stronger up here, pressing against my jacket, carrying the faint smell of rain even though the sky looked mostly clear. I found a small flat area sheltered by a line of stunted pines and decided to camp there for the night. It was high enough for a view but tucked in enough to block some of the wind. I pitched my tent, boiled water for dinner, and watched the sun go down behind a far ridge, the light bleeding orange and pink into the sky. The night air came quick and cold. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the sound of the wind threading through the trees above me. Day 2 started with a sharp drop in temperature. My breath came in faint clouds as I packed up. The trail ran along the ridgeline for a while before dipping into a wide basin. The basin was open, filled with low grass and scattered boulders. I could see animal tracks in the dirt, deer, elk, maybe a bear. My boots crunched over frost-hardened ground. The sun hadn't yet reached this hollow, and it felt like a place that had been asleep for a long time. It was in that basin that I first noticed something wasn't right. At first, it was just the wind, how it shifted suddenly, coming in harder, colder, carrying a smell that wasn't rain exactly but something sharp and metallic. Then I saw the sky changing. The horizon to the west darkened, clouds stacking into heavy walls. I checked my map. The route would take me into a narrow pass later in the day, but if weather moved in too quickly, that could be dangerous. Storms up here didn't play by the rules. They could come down hard, and once you were in the pass, there'd be nowhere to go. I sped up, but the wind picked up faster. My hood snapped against my ears. By the time I reached the edge of the basin, the first drops of rain hit, cold and heavy. I stopped and pulled on my rain shell, cinching the hood tight. The rain turned to sleet within minutes, stinging my face. My boots slid on wet rock as I started the climb into the pass. The higher I went, the worse it got. The sleet turned to snow, thick, wet flakes that clung to everything. My visibility dropped until the world was just white and the dark blur of rock in front of me. I kept moving, telling myself to focus on each step, not the distance. My gloves soaked through, and I lost feeling in my fingertips. My legs burned from the climb. I thought about turning back, but the idea of descending those slippery rocks felt just as bad. Somewhere near the top of the pass, my right boot caught on a hidden root or rock under the snow. I went down hard, my knee slamming against something sharp. The shock of pain ripped through me. I sat there for a second, snow landing in my lap, trying to breathe through it. My knee throbbed. I tested it, pain shot up my thigh, but it held my weight. I kept going, slower now, careful with every step. Crossing the pass felt like hours. By the time I started descending the far side, my clothes were damp from the inside out, my teeth chattering. I needed shelter. The map showed no official campsites nearby, but I spotted a cluster of fir trees down a slope and made for them. The ground under their branches was dry, and the snow wasn't as heavy there. I dropped my pack, hands shaking as I set up the tent. My fingers barely worked the zippers. Inside, I stripped off the wet layers, stuffed them into a corner, and crawled into my sleeping bag. Took a long time to feel any warmth. My knee swelled, a deep, pulsing ache under the skin. The sound of the storm outside didn't stop. It drummed on the tent for hours. I thought about how far I still was from the trailhead. At least 20 miles. If the storm didn't let up, and my knee got worse, that distance might as well have been 100. When morning came, the snow had stopped, but the world outside was covered in white. The trail was gone under it. My knee stiffened overnight, and every step sent a dull ache through my leg. I decided to cut the loop short, taking a connector trail back toward the start. It would still be 2 long days. The map showed it crossing low ground and following another creek, which meant fewer climbs. But the first challenge was finding the actual trail under all that snow. It was slow going. Sometimes I'd lose the faint depression of the path and have to backtrack. The cold hadn't lifted, and a thin fog hung in the air. My boots were wet again within an hour, the cold seeping into my toes. My shoulders ached from the pack. I drank from the creek without filtering, too cold and tired to bother. I told myself the water was clean enough this high up. By late afternoon, the clouds dropped lower, and the light dimmed early. I hadn't seen a single sign of another person since I left the trailhead. No footprints in the snow but mine. I camped again in a small grove near the creek, the sound of running water constant in the background. I ate the last of my jerky and a packet of oatmeal, forcing it down even though I wasn't hungry. My stomach felt tight from the cold and the strain. The last day was the hardest. My knee felt worse. The snow thinned as I dropped elevation, but the trail turned muddy, slick with meltwater. At one point, the bank under my right boot gave way and I slid into the creek up to my shins. The shock of it knocked the breath out of me. I scrambled out, cursing under my breath, my clothes dripping. I kept moving, knowing I couldn't stop for long without freezing. Hours later, I saw the first sign of the trailhead, a weathered wooden post leaning at an angle, half buried in mud. My car was just beyond it, a dark shape between the trees. The sight hit me with a wave of relief so strong I almost laughed. I limped the last 100 yards, tossed my pack into the back seat, and sat behind the wheel with the heater blasting. My hands shook not from cold now, but from the release of tension. I sat there for a long time, watching steam rise from my wet pants, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. Driving away, the mountains looked beautiful again from a distance, white-topped, sharp against the blue sky. You wouldn't know, looking at them, how quickly they could strip you down to the barest thought of survival. I'd gone in for quiet and found it, but not the kind I'd imagined. It was the kind that presses against you, reminds you how small you are, and leaves you carrying that feeling long after you're back in the safety of walls and warm air. I've been hiking alone for years, but 2017 was the year I pushed myself further than I ever had before. I had just turned 30, and after moving from Portland to Bend, Oregon, I wanted to explore the trails that cut deep into the eastern slopes of the Cascades. I'd been out there in all seasons, but I'd never done a long solo day hike in late October, when the weather can swing from sunny and calm to brutal in a matter of hours. I thought I was ready. The trail I picked was called the Ridge Trail, an 18-mile out and back that followed a narrow spine between two steep valleys before ending at a weather station. It wasn't a popular hike. The Forest Service website listed it as strenuous and not recommended for solo travel after September. The main concerns were weather, exposure, and how easy it was to get disoriented if fog rolled in. But I had checked the forecast. Mild temperatures, low wind, partly cloudy. No storms in sight. I packed light, maybe too light. My day pack held a single 1-liter bottle of water, a collapsible filter, a granola bar, a sandwich, a windbreaker, a folded map in a Ziploc bag, and a small first aid kit. I left my heavy fleece in the car because it felt warm at the trailhead, somewhere around 60 degrees. My boots were broken in leather with deep tread, and my socks were thick wool. I remember thinking, this is perfect hiking weather. The first 5 miles were all uphill. The trail cut through old Douglas fir and cedar, the ground spongy with decades of fallen needles. The air smelled like wet earth. The only sounds were the occasional scatter of squirrels in the underbrush and the steady crunch of my boots. As I climbed higher, the trees began to thin, letting in more sky. I could see across to the opposite valley, where the slopes were streaked with yellow larch trees and patches of bare rock. By mile 7, the trail narrowed to barely 2 feet across, with steep drops on both sides. I'd read about this section, the knife edge. In dry weather, it's fine, but I still placed each foot carefully. I tried not to look down at the several hundred feet of empty space. The wind had picked up, just a little, and I noticed clouds gathering far to the west, but they seemed harmless. When I reached the weather station at the far end, it was almost 1 in the afternoon. The station was just a squat metal building with a locked door and a small antenna. I sat with my back against it, ate my sandwich, and drank half my water. The clouds were closer now, their edges frayed like pulled cotton. A steady wind came from the west, pushing against my jacket. I told myself I'd just start heading back sooner than planned. Half a mile into the return trip, I noticed the air temperature dropping. It was subtle at first, then sharper. The wind got stronger, pulling at the brim of my cap. I pulled my windbreaker tight, zipping it up to my neck. By the time I reached the knife edge section, the sky had turned gray. Shadows disappeared. The sun was gone behind a thickening sheet of cloud. The first snowflakes came just past mile 12. At first they melted as soon as they hit the ground, but within minutes they were sticking. I wasn't worried yet. I knew the trail well enough, and I had my map. But the snow made the ridge's narrow sections slick, and I started using my hands to steady myself on the occasional outcrop of rock. The wind gusts were strong enough now to throw me slightly off balance. I just passed a switchback when I realized how quiet it had become. The wind still hissed in the trees, but there was no sound of birds or squirrels. I glanced back and saw that the valley below had vanished into a swirling white wall of snow. Visibility had dropped to maybe 50 feet. That's when I made my first mistake. Instead of stopping to check my exact position on the map, I told myself I knew the way. The ridge trail was straightforward, I thought, just keep following the crest, and it would lead back to the trailhead. The snow thickened fast, coating the ground in a slick layer that hid roots and rocks. My boots slipped more often. The wind was constant now, not just gusting. My fingers ached from the cold, and I kept shoving them into my armpits whenever I paused. I passed a large boulder I didn't remember seeing on the way in. I told myself it was just a detail I'd missed earlier, but doubt was creeping in. I pulled out my map, but standing in the wind to study, it was almost useless. Snow stuck to the paper and the ridges on the map all looked the same. The compass I carried was small and cheap, the kind you clip to a zipper pull. I tried to orient it, but the ridge curved and twisted in ways that didn't match what I remembered. At mile 14, or what I thought was mile 14, the trail seemed to split. One path dipped down to the left, still narrow but with fewer rocks. The other continued along the top. I couldn't recall any split here, but I chose the left path because the wind was tearing across the ridge from the right side, and the lower trail offered some shelter. I followed it for maybe a quarter mile before the snow covered everything so evenly I could no longer see if I was on a path at all. The ground sloped gently at first, then more steeply. I kept thinking I'd intersect the main trail again, but the slope only kept dropping. By then, my water was nearly gone. My gloves were damp from brushing snow off rocks, and my legs were cramping from constantly bracing my steps. Every few minutes, I'd look up and see nothing but gray, the snow blurring the edges of trees and rocks until everything blended together. Eventually, I came to a stand of small pines packed tightly together. The ground here was uneven, with snow filling the low spots. I pushed through, telling myself I'd stop on the other side and get my bearings. But on the far side was only more forest, thicker and darker. That was when the second wave of fear hit. Not the adrenaline spike of slipping on a ledge or seeing a storm, but the slow, heavy realization that I might actually be lost. I forced myself to stop moving. I pulled out the map again, crouching to shield it from the wind, and tried to match the contour lines to the slopes around me. But without being able to see more than 50 feet in any direction, it was impossible. I could be anywhere along the ridge or even on a spur that branched off. I knew the number one rule was to stay put if you're lost, but I also knew I didn't have the gear to spend the night. My windbreaker was already damp inside from sweat, and the temperature was still dropping. I decided my best chance was to keep moving downhill, figuring I'd eventually hit a creek or forest road. The descent was slow. My boots slid on hidden patches of ice beneath the snow, and more than once I went down hard on one knee. My right thigh began to throb from bracing every step. The snow was now thick enough to grab at my ankles. After an hour of this, I stumbled into a small clearing with a fallen log across one side. The wind had died here, and the snow fell almost straight down. I took the chance to kneel and drink the last of my water. My breath was loud in my ears. I kept going. Another half hour, maybe more, and I began to hear a faint rushing sound. At first I thought it was wind, but then I saw a narrow ribbon of water cutting through the trees ahead. Relief surged through me. A creek meant a route to lower ground. I followed it, staying on the bank where the snow wasn't as deep. But creeks twist and turn, and the bank was littered with deadfall. More than once I had to climb over or around thick tangles of branches. My legs burned. My feet were wet. I lost track of time entirely. By the time the light began to dim, I spotted something unnatural through the trees. A straight, vertical line. I pushed closer and saw a weathered wooden post with a strip of faded orange paint. It looked like an old trail marker. I followed it, and 50 yards later I saw another. The line of posts led to a faint path, half hidden under the snow, that curved sharply left. I followed it, my pace quickening despite the fatigue. Within 10 minutes, the trees opened onto a gravel road. It was plowed, though a thin layer of snow dusted the surface. I turned right, guessing it led downhill. 15 minutes later, I heard the hum of an engine. A pickup truck came around the bend, slowing as it neared me. The driver, a man in a green parka, rolled down his window and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I'm sure I looked half frozen. He told me the road led to Highway 20 and offered me a ride. I climbed in, the warmth of the cab hitting me like a wave. As we drove, I glanced back at the ridge, now just a dark outline against the white sky. I realized how easily it could have gone the other way, how one more wrong turn, one more hour in that cold, could have been the end of me. I didn't feel relief until we reached the highway and I saw my car parked at the trailhead, dusted with snow. I thanked the driver and sat for a while in the driver's seat with the heater blasting, staring out at the trail sign. I've hiked plenty since that day, but I've never gone back to the Ridge Trail. And I've never again started a hike without enough gear to survive a night, because sometimes the difference between making it back and not isn't luck. It's preparation. It was late September of 2018 when I decided to hike the Sawatch Range in Colorado alone. I had done plenty of day hikes before, but this one was different. I had been reading about a trail called Horseshoe Basin Loop, a long, high-altitude route that looped around the base of Mount Sherman. The guide online made it sound like a peaceful, challenging trek, about 15 miles, with steady elevation gain and views of the valley. I figured I'd leave early, finish before sunset, and be back in town for dinner. I packed my day bag the night before, water bladder with 2 liters of water, 2 protein bars, a small bag of trail mix, my phone, a paper topo map, compass, a headlamp just in case, and my folding hiking poles. I also threw in my thin rain jacket because the forecast mentioned a small chance of showers in the afternoon. The morning started cold, just below 40 degrees, with a thin layer of frost on my car windows. I parked at a gravel pull-off near the trailhead around 6:15 a.m. The lot was empty. My breath hung in the air as I adjusted my backpack straps. The rising sun painted the peaks pale gold, and everything felt still. The silence was almost heavy, broken only by the crunch of my boots on frozen dirt as I set out. The first few miles were easy, wide, clear trail through sparse pine forest, occasional switchbacks, and a gentle climb. My breathing settled into a steady rhythm. I remember thinking how good it felt to be out there with no one else around, no noise except the wind. By mile 4, the trees began to thin and the trail opened into an alpine meadow. The ground was dotted with yellow grass and scattered rocks. In the distance, I could see the jagged outline of Mount Sherman's ridgeline. The air was thinner here, and every step made my thighs burn slightly. I stopped once to adjust my poles, glancing back toward the way I'd come. The valley was hazy in the distance. That was when I noticed something, nothing supernatural, just a feeling. There was no movement anywhere, no squirrels, no birds, just wind. It wasn't alarming yet, but it was strange enough that I kept glancing over my shoulder for no reason. I followed the trail as it began to narrow, hugging the side of a steep slope. The drop to my right was sharp, littered with loose scree. I slowed my pace, placing each step carefully. This section curved around a rocky outcrop, and when I rounded it, the wind suddenly hit harder. It wasn't strong enough to knock me over, but it was a constant push, almost like it wanted me off the trail. I zipped my jacket, pulled the hood over my cap, and kept moving. My eyes watered from the cold air. Around mile 7, I reached a high point where the trail split. One path continued along the loop, the other descended toward the basin floor. According to my map, both eventually reconnected, but the lower route would take me through a marshy section that could be muddy. I decided to stick to the higher trail. Not long after that decision, I realized the terrain was changing faster than I expected. The dirt underfoot gave way to a mix of loose gravel and larger, flat rocks that tilted when I stepped on them. My boots skidded once or twice, and each time my heart kicked up. The slope to my right was so steep that a bad slip would mean a long, tumbling fall. The wind was stronger now, and clouds were forming far off to the west. I glanced at my watch, just past 11 a.m. I still had half the loop to go, so I pushed on. The trail curved again, and this time I stepped onto a section where the ground felt oddly soft under the gravel. I stopped, pressing down with my pole. The surface shifted slightly. My gut told me it was unstable. I sidestepped onto a larger rock and carefully picked my way around it. About half a mile later, the trail became less defined. I knew from the topo map that this part skirted an old mining site, and erosion had worn parts of the path away. I could still see faint boot prints in the dust, so I followed them, but the ground was uneven, crisscrossed with shallow rivulets carved by snowmelt. I moved slower here, scanning ahead for the next cairn, a little stack of rocks marking the route. The first few cairns were easy to spot, but after the third one, I couldn't find the next. I stopped, scanned the slope ahead, then turned to look behind me. That was when my stomach dropped a little. The path I had come from looked different now. The angle of the slope and the scatter of rocks made it hard to tell exactly where I had walked. I knew the general direction, but the trail itself seemed to fade into the hillside. I pulled the map from my pocket and compared it with the landscape. The contour lines told me I was in the right general area, but without the cairns, my confidence faltered. I kept moving forward, hoping I'd spot the next marker. 15 minutes later, I still hadn't found it. The slope became steeper, and the ground was looser. Every step sent tiny rocks skittering downhill. I knew I had to be careful. An ankle injury out here could turn bad fast. I stopped to take a sip of water and check my phone. No signal. I expected that, but it still added a weight to my chest. The clouds were closer now, darker, and the wind had a cold bite. I decided to climb slightly upward, thinking it might give me a better view of the trail ahead. The climb was harder than I thought. My boots kept slipping on the loose scree, and I had to use my hands a few times to grab at rocks for balance. When I finally reached a flatter patch, I turned slowly, scanning every ridge and hollow. That's when I realized how easy it would be to get turned around up here. The land looked the same in every direction. Gray rock, yellow grass, and patches of snow clinging to shadows. My brain kept insisting I recognized certain shapes, but when I looked again, they seemed different. The first drop of rain hit my cheek just as I spotted what I thought was the trail, angling upward toward another ridge. I decided to follow it. The trail quickly turned into a faint line that disappeared among rocks. I kept going anyway, driven by the idea that just over the ridge I'd see the loop reconnect. The wind picked up sharply, and then it started, a quick, stinging sleet that made the rocks slick. My fingers began to numb. I shoved my hands into my jacket pockets for warmth. When I reached the ridge, my stomach sank. The other side wasn't the loop trail. It was another slope, steeper and more exposed, dropping into a wide, rocky basin. No clear path, no sign of footprints. The sky was darker now, the storm moving in faster than I wanted to admit. I checked my watch, 1:12 p.m. I knew I had at least 4 miles left to reach my car if I was on the loop, but now I wasn't sure where I was. My legs were starting to ache from all the side hill walking, and the thought of retracing my steps on those loose rocks made me clench my jaw. I decided to drop into the basin. The slope was bad, sharp chunks of rock mixed with unstable dirt, but the basin floor looked like it leveled out and maybe connected with the lower route I'd avoided earlier. I took my time, planting each step, using my poles for balance. A few times the dirt gave way and I slid a couple of feet, my heart hammering each time. The sleet was heavier now, clinking off my hood. My boots were wet. When I finally reached the bottom, I realized the ground was soggy. My foot sank into cold mud up to my ankle, and I cursed under my breath. I picked my way across the basin, trying to stay on higher patches of grass. The wind was muted down here, but the air felt heavy. I scanned constantly for any sign of a trail, cut bank, trampled grass, anything, but saw nothing. The basin was bigger than it had looked from above, and walking across it felt endless. About halfway through, I stopped. There, maybe 200 yards away, was something lying in the grass. At first, I thought it was a large rock, but as I got closer, I saw it was an old, weathered backpack. The fabric was faded and ripped, and one strap was completely torn off. I didn't touch it. I just stood there for a moment, staring at it, feeling an odd twist in my gut. Whoever had carried it had left it here a long time ago. I forced myself to keep moving, By the time I reached the far side of the basin, my legs were burning and my water bladder was almost empty. I climbed a low rise, hoping to spot the lower trail. The first thing I saw was the valley floor in the far distance, and between me and it, another set of ridges. My stomach tightened. I was farther off course than I thought. I checked the map again, tracing my finger along the contour lines, trying to match them to what I was seeing. I made a rough guess. If I kept heading east, I might intersect a jeep road that led back toward the trailhead, but it would mean cutting straight across uneven ground without a marked path. I did it anyway. The wind had shifted again, now blowing cold and straight into my face. My jacket was damp, my gloves were soaked, and I could feel my toes numbing. I trudged forward, watching every step, my mind locked on one thought: just keep going. The landscape blurred into a rhythm of gray rock, yellow grass, and the crunch of my boots. I stumbled once and banged my knee on a boulder, pain shooting up my thigh. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, fighting off the urge to just sit down. Hours seemed to pass before